My mother-in-law spread a lie that my daughter was stealing from people. My wife didn't defend her. She actually believed it. Soon, my little girl lost her friends and was kicked off her school activities. They thought they were teaching her respect, but I had proof, and I made sure the truth came out. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Oliver Rourke knew what his life was. He didn't need anyone to explain it to him, didn't need someone to compare it to something better or worse. He worked the early shift at a tire plant on Route 9, clocking in at 5:30 in the morning while the sky was still black and his neighbors were still in bed. The work was loud, repetitive, and suffocating in the summer heat. The smell of rubber pressed itself into his clothes, his hair, the creases of his hands. Amelia would run his work shirts through the wash twice, and the smell still clung. He didn't complain about it. The paycheck came every 2 weeks without fail. The health insurance covered the family, and there was always enough left over for groceries and something small for Mary. Steady mattered. In a working-class neighborhood outside Akron, where half the houses had a car up on blocks and the other half had for rent signs peeling in the window, steady was more than most people had. He lived on Ferris Street with his wife and daughter in a 2-bedroom house that needed a new coat of paint every few years and had a back door that stuck in winter when the frame swelled with cold. He'd grown up 4 blocks from here. He knew the street in the way you only know a place you've never really left, which dogs barked at what hour, which family ate dinner loud, which porch lights stayed on all night out of habit or loneliness. It was ordinary. He had made his peace with ordinary a long time ago. He wasn't a man who needed spectacle. What he needed, the one thing that sharpened every ordinary day into something worth having, was Mary. Mary Rourke was 8 years old and quiet in the particular way that thoughtful children are, the kind of quiet that isn't shyness but attention. She observed the world carefully before she spoke about it. She had a small green notebook that went everywhere with her, tucked under her arm at school, beside her plate at dinner, on the nightstand when she slept, and she filled it with drawings. Animals, houses, hands, the specific shape of the tree in their backyard, the pattern of light through the kitchen window on a Saturday morning. She drew the way some kids talked, constantly, compulsively, like it was the method her mind used to process being alive in a body in a world full of things to look at. Oliver would sometimes find a notebook left open on the kitchen table, a half-finished sketch of their backyard or the dog from down the street, and he'd stand there for a moment just looking at it before he closed it gently and set it beside her school bag. He loved her with the uncomplicated certainty of a man who is paying attention. It wasn't about grand gestures or speeches. It was the daily accumulation of small things. Packing her lunch on Saturday mornings because she said sandwiches tasted different when he made them, driving her to the library on Sunday afternoons, and letting her pick as many books as she could carry, coaching her soccer team for 1 season until the commute made it impossible and he had to apologize to her about it in a way that stuck with him for months. When her teacher mentioned early in the year that Mary had a genuine gift for drawing, Oliver signed her up for an after-school art program before the school week was out. He brought her small things when he could, a new set of colored pencils in a tin case, a soft hoodie in the dark green she liked, a box of the cereal she loved that their store only stocked sometimes. She received every one of these things with a seriousness that got him every time. She'd hold the object with both hands and look at it. And then she'd look up at him with those wide, dark eyes and say, "Thank you, Dad," in a voice so genuine it could knock the air out of you. That connection, that ordinary, daily, clean love between a father and his daughter, was precisely what Delia Crane could not tolerate. Delia was Amelia's mother. She was a compact, sharp-featured woman in her early 60s with pale blue eyes that missed very little and a voice that carried, regardless of the size of the room. She came with opinions already formed on every subject: how Amelia kept the house, how Oliver spent his money, how Mary was being raised, what the neighborhood was doing wrong, what needed to change. She delivered these opinions the way people deliver weather, without apology, without solicitation, as a simple report on conditions. She came over multiple times a week and let herself in without knocking, which Oliver had stopped remarking on years ago. She settled in the living room armchair, his armchair, technically, though you would not have known it from the way she occupied it, and held court while Amelia made tea and brought it out. Oliver would come home from the plant, smelling of rubber and cold air, and find them there. He would nod to Delia. She would nod back. The performance of civility was well practiced. On a Sunday afternoon in late September, Oliver brought Mary a hoodie he'd found on clearance at the hardware store. Dark green, fleece-lined, exactly her size. He watched her pull it over her head and hold out her arms and spin around to show the little embroidered flower on the sleeve. She was beaming. "You're spoiling that child," Delia said. She had been watching from the armchair with her tea balanced on one knee. "It's a hoodie," Oliver said. He kept his voice friendly. He'd learned that engaging Delia seriously only prolonged things. "It's a habit," she said. "She'll expect the world to work that way. You hand her something every time you walk through the door, and she learns that's what she deserves." "That's not love, Oliver. That's avoidance." He looked at Mary, who was still holding out her arms, examining the sleeve. She had not heard the word avoidance. She was completely absorbed in the flower. He looked back at Delia. "She's 8, he said. Delia pursed her lips. "You'll see," she said, in the tone of a woman who was very certain she was right and was willing to wait as long as necessary to be proven so. Oliver looked to Amelia, who was standing just inside the kitchen doorway, watching all of this. She caught his eye and then looked at the floor. That look, the quiet downward turn, the retreat into neutrality, was something Oliver had been reading for years. It meant Amelia had heard everything and had already decided, in that private inner courtroom she ran, to side with her mother. Not forcefully, not obviously, just by not siding with him. Oliver had made his peace with that dynamic a long time ago. The way you make peace with a piece of furniture that's too heavy to move, you arrange your life around it and stop thinking about whether it should be somewhere else. He told himself it was manageable. He told himself that Amelia loved her mother in a complicated, knotted way and that it wasn't his business to untangle it. He was wrong. He just didn't know yet how wrong. Oliver and Amelia had met young, 23 and 22, at a party thrown by a mutual friend in a house 2 streets over from Ferris Street. She had been sharp-witted and warm-eyed and laughed easily, and he had liked her immediately in the uncomplicated way you like someone when you are young and everything still seems possible. They had married when they were both 25, bought the house on Ferris Street a year later, and for a while it had been good. Genuinely good. They had cooked dinner together on weeknights and watched movies on the couch on Friday nights and talked about the future with the kind of easy confidence that comes before the future actually arrives. Delia had been there from the beginning, of course. She had always been there. But in the early years, she kept a slightly more respectful distance. She came over once a week, not 4 times, and she made comments about the house and the cooking rather than about the marriage itself. Oliver had understood her, in those years, as a fixture of Amelia's life that he was learning to navigate. Like a low doorway you got used to ducking. You could live with a low doorway if you remember to duck. He had remembered to duck for a long time. Mary arrived when they were 28, and something shifted, not badly at first. Delia had strong opinions about child rearing, as she had strong opinions about everything. And some of those opinions actually aligned with Oliver's, which had surprised him. But Mary's birth also gave Delia something she hadn't had before, a direct, urgent reason to be present every single day. She had reframed herself as indispensable. And Amelia, exhausted from the first months of new motherhood, had accepted the reframe. Oliver had watched that dynamic establish itself, and had told himself it was temporary. New babies required support. Things would level out. They always leveled out. He had been patient and steady and had kept ducking the low doorway, and the years had accumulated, and he had not noticed that the doorway was getting lower. The first accusation came on a Tuesday in late October. It reached Oliver through his neighbor Glenn, who lived 2 doors down and had a son in Mary's class. Glenn caught him in the driveway on a weekday evening and mentioned it the way people mention things they want to pass along without being responsible for, sideways, with a shrug built into every sentence. "My wife heard from Linda Ferris that some money went missing at the class fundraiser. Couple dollars from the collection jar." Glenn shifted his weight. "Somebody said they saw your girl near the table." Oliver kept his face still. Near the table, or taking money from the table? "I don't know all the details. Just figured you should know what's going around." Oliver thanked him and went inside. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and thought about it. He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about anything that came at Mary. Kids were near tables. Kids at fundraisers touched everything on every surface. Accusations at that age were often more about social friction than fact. He filed it away as the small, unfortunate kind of misunderstanding that happened in every elementary school and typically vanished within a week. It happened again. Mary's teacher mentioned that a pencil pouch had disappeared from a desk the previous Friday. The same afternoon Mary had borrowed a pencil from that side of the room. The teacher framed it gently. She wasn't pointing a finger, she was just mentioning in case Oliver hadn't noticed anything at home. Oliver thanked her, bought a replacement pouch for the other child, and set it down as coincidence. 2 coincidences. Still manageable. Still nothing solid. He might have continued classifying these things as coincidences if Delia hadn't brought it up at dinner that Friday. It was a regular evening. Pot roast, the table set, the overhead light too bright the way it always was. Delia had arrived uninvited at 4:30, as she often did, and positioned herself at the head of the table. Mary was in her usual seat, pushing food around her plate, her green notebook just barely visible in her jacket pocket. Oliver was eating and mostly thinking about a report he needed to file at work before Monday. "I've been hearing things," Delia said. She said it with a particular weight, deliberate and slow, the way someone speaks when they want what they're saying to settle. Oliver looked up. "What kind of things?" "About Mary. At school and around. Missing items. More than one situation now." She folded her hands. "It might be worth paying attention. I didn't take anything." Mary's voice came out flat and clear. She had set down her fork. She was looking directly at Delia with an expression that was more adult than her age should have allowed. Certain, calm, slightly stung. "I didn't take anything from anyone." Delia looked at her with an expression that was almost gentle and completely unsettling. "I'm sure you didn't mean to cause any trouble." "I didn't take anything," Mary said again. Louder this time. Oliver watched Amelia. She was looking at her plate. She was cutting her pot, roast into small, careful squares. She did not look up. She did not say the simple, immediate thing. "We know, sweetheart, we believe you," the thing that would have taken 2 seconds and meant everything. She just kept cutting. The silence at that table was heavier than anything that had been said out loud. The accusations did not stop. They multiplied and changed shape, the way rumors do when they find a willing community. Each version slightly larger than the last, the details softening, the certainty hardening. By November, it was no longer about a few dollars at a fundraiser or a pencil pouch. It had become a story with a clean, memorable shape. Mary Rourke takes things that aren't hers. Oliver could not identify the exact moment when it crossed from rumor into accepted fact, but he could see the evidence of the crossing. At school, kids shifted their belongings when Mary sat down nearby. Small, unconscious movements that kids make when they've absorbed something from the adults around them and don't know they're acting on it. A birthday party invitation that the teacher confirmed the whole class had received never arrived in their mailbox. 2 girls who had come over to play in the summer weren't coming over anymore. At home, the shift was subtler but more damaging. Amelia began checking Mary's backpack. Oliver came home one Wednesday evening to find Mary standing at the kitchen table with her backpack fully emptied in front of her. Pencils, folders, a crumpled homework sheet, a broken crayon, the green notebook, all of it spread across the table in a line. Amelia was at the counter with her arms crossed. The room had the specific quiet of a situation that had already reached its conclusion before Oliver arrived. "What's this?" he said. "Just checking," Amelia said. She didn't look at him when she said it. "Checking for what exactly?" "You know what." He looked at Mary. She was gathering her things methodically back into the bag, her movements practiced and contained. She had the expression he'd begun to recognize, the tight jaw, the eyes focused downward, the careful suppression of whatever was behind them. She had learned not to cry in the kitchen. She had learned it recently, and he hated that she'd had to. "That's enough for tonight," he said to Amelia, keeping his voice even. "She needs to be honest." Amelia started. "She hasn't been dishonest." "Put her stuff back, Mary." Mary put her stuff back. She zipped the bag and went upstairs without being asked to. Oliver and Amelia stood in the kitchen. He kept his voice down. "You're searching her bag based on your mother's gossip. There's been more than one incident. Name one incident that's been verified. One item that was actually found in her bag. One teacher who filed a formal report." Amelia was quiet. "There isn't one," Oliver said. "Because nothing has happened. Your mother is telling you a story, and you're acting on it. Or your daughter is smarter than you think she is." He went upstairs after that and sat on the edge of Mary's bed. She was already under the covers, the green notebook open in her lap. She wasn't drawing. She was just looking at a blank page. "You okay?" he said. She thought about it for a moment. "Mom thinks I'm a bad person," she said. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, like she was reporting a fact rather than feeling a wound. The wound was there. He could see it. She just didn't have the vocabulary yet to name it as a wound. "Mom is confused right now," Oliver said. "That's about her, not about you." Mary closed the notebook. "Okay," she said, but she said it without fully believing it, and he could tell the difference. He stayed until she fell asleep. For a few minutes after, he sat there in the dim room, listening to her breathe. He thought about what it cost a child to go through this. Not the dramatic, visible cost, but the quiet daily cost of waking up each morning and going to school in a neighborhood where a story about you was already settled, already known, already the context in which every small action you took would be interpreted. He thought about the way Mary had been carrying herself lately. Slightly careful, slightly watchful, the way people carry themselves when they expect to be accused of something. She was 8. No child should move through the world that way. He went out into the hallway and stood there in the dark for a long time. He thought about Delia, about the fundraiser, the pencil pouch, the dinner table, the backpack searches. He thought about the thread that ran through all of it. He thought about who was always present, always nearby, always the first to hear and the first to report. He didn't have proof yet, but he was beginning to understand what he was looking at. The call from the school came on a Thursday morning in early December. Oliver was on a 15-minute break at the plant, standing near the loading dock where the reception was better, drinking coffee from a paper cup that had gone cold. The assistant principal's voice was careful and deliberately modulated, the voice of a professional delivering information they knew was indefensible. Mary had been removed from the after-school art program. Oliver set the cup down on the dock railing. Why? Several parents raised concerns about their children's belongings while in shared spaces. Given the number of concerns, the number, he said. How many? 2? 3? What specific incident prompted this? There was a pause. It was more of a cumulative concern. Cumulative based on what verified incident? What item was taken? What date? What teacher made a report? He kept his voice level. He was good at keeping his voice level. He'd been practicing it for 2 months. Mr. Rourke, I understand this is upsetting, but the other parents were uncomfortable with an 8-year-old, he said. My 8-year-old who has been in that program since September without a single documented incident, who has had her work displayed, who her teacher describes as one of the most focused students in the group. I understand, I don't think you do. He picked up the cup. I'll be speaking to a lawyer about this. He meant it, and the silence on the other end told him they believed him. He ended the call. He stood at the loading dock with the cold pressing in around him. The rubber smell drifted out from the open bay doors behind him. He finished the cold coffee and went back to work because there was nothing else to do for the next 8 hours. He drove home that evening in silence with the radio off. He cooked dinner, pasta, simple, and sat across from Mary and watched her eat. She didn't know yet. She had been told at pickup that the after-school schedule was changing, and she'd accepted that because she was 8 and believed adults when they explained things. Oliver had asked the teacher to keep it neutral until he could tell her himself. That was the one small thing he'd been able to control. He told her after dinner, in her room, sitting on the edge of the bed. He kept it short and honest. There had been some misunderstanding, and until he got it sorted out, she would be coming home with him after regular school. She listened. Her hands were in her lap, loose and still. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, Dad, why does everyone think I'm bad? It wasn't self-pity. It wasn't a dramatic question. It was a genuine inquiry from a child who had been trying in good faith to understand a situation that didn't make sense and who had run out of explanations that fit. She looked at him with those wide, dark, patient eyes and waited. Oliver had been a father for 8 years. He had handled skinned knees and nightmares, and the first funeral and the first time a friend was cruel. But he sat there in that room, and this question reached past all his practiced steadiness and got somewhere real and deep and painful. Not everyone, he said, and the people who do, they're wrong. And I'm going to prove it. She studied his face for a moment, deciding. Then she nodded, slow and serious. Okay, she said. He stayed until she was asleep. He pulled her door most of the way closed and stood in the hallway. He thought about Delia, about the fundraiser, the pencil pouch, the bag checks, the birthday invitation, and now this. He thought about the thread connecting all of it and who held the other end. He was done waiting to understand. He was going to do something about it. Delia did not operate out in the open. That would have been too visible, too easy to answer. She worked the way certain damage works, slowly, consistently, at the foundations, so that by the time the structure showed signs of trouble, you couldn't point to a single moment and say this is where it started. Oliver understood this in retrospect. Looking back, he could map every move. She came over more frequently now. 3 times a week had become 4, sometimes 5. She arrived in the afternoons while Oliver was still at the plant and was settled in with Amelia by the time he got home. Tea on the table, voices already at the low, confiding pitch of women who had been talking for a while. When he came through the back door, they would shift into something more surface level, dinner plans, neighborhood updates, nothing, the way conversations shift when the person being talked about enters the room. But Oliver started coming home by different routes. He started using the front door. He started arriving before he was expected. He heard things. "You're too patient with him," Delia said one evening, her voice carrying clearly through the wall of the hallway where Oliver had stopped to remove his boots. "He makes the decisions, and you manage around them. That's not a partnership." On another occasion, "She lights up for him and not for you. You're doing the invisible work, the discipline, the consistency, the hard parts, and he gets to be the hero. That's not fair to you." The worst was a Thursday evening when he came for the front door earlier than expected and heard Delia's voice from the bedroom. "He only cares about that girl. You come second in your own marriage, Amelia. You know it's true. You've known it for a long time." Oliver stood in the hallway with one hand on the banister and listened to the silence that followed. He waited for Amelia's rebuttal. He waited for the pushback, the simple refusal, the sound of someone defending her own marriage. What he heard instead was a soft sound of agreement, barely audible, and then the conversation moving on to something else. He went back outside. He stood on the front step in the cold for a few minutes. He breathed the night air. Then he went back in and started making dinner like nothing had happened, because that was what the moment required. But he was tracking everything now. Every visit, every overheard fragment, every shift in Amelia's expression and posture and behavior. He was building a picture. Delia wasn't just feeding the neighborhood a story about Mary. She was feeding Amelia a different, longer story about her own life. She was telling Amelia that she was unhappy, that she deserved better, that Oliver was the reason. She had been telling it for years in small pieces, but something had changed in the past months. The pieces were arriving faster, and Amelia was accepting them faster. Oliver understood what Delia wanted. She wanted him out. She had always wanted him out, probably. He was the obstacle between herself and her daughter, the thing in the house that had more claim on Amelia than she did. Getting rid of him through direct confrontation was never going to work. He'd simply never given her grounds for that. So she was manufacturing grounds. A husband who neglected his wife, a daughter who stole, a family that needed to be corrected. He sat with that understanding and let it settle. He was going to need proof. He was going to need something that couldn't be explained away. He was going to need patience. He found the messages on a Wednesday night. He hadn't planned to look at Amelia's phone. He was up at 3 a.m. because Mary had woken from a bad dream. She'd been having them intermittently for weeks, short and frightening, always involving school, and he'd sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing slowed and she drifted back down. Coming back down the hallway in the dark, he passed the kitchen where Amelia's phone was charging on the counter. The screen was lit with a message notification. He looked at it the way you look at something you didn't mean to see. A name he didn't recognize. A short message, just a time and an address. Something about the name and the hour and the terseness of it made him pick up the phone. He stood at the counter in the dark kitchen and scrolled up. The thread went back 3 months. The man's name was Derek. The messages were careful and somewhat guarded. The careful, guarded quality of two people who are aware they are doing something they shouldn't and are managing the paper trail, but clear enough to read once you knew what you were looking at. There was warmth in them, a specific intimate warmth that Oliver had not seen in any conversation Amelia had with him in 6 months. There were evenings accounted for, grocery runs and visits to Delia that now had different explanations. There were plans. Oliver put the phone back down in exactly the position he'd found it. He looked at the counter for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. He went back to bed. He lay on his back in the dark with his hands at his sides. Amelia was asleep beside him, turned away, her breathing even. He thought about Mary asking, "Why does everyone think I'm bad?" He thought about the backpack emptied on the table, the art program, the birthday invitation that never arrived, the months of systematic erosion that he had been watching in real time while trying to stay steady enough for his daughter. He thought about Delia's voice. He only cares about that girl. He thought about Amelia at the dinner table, cutting her pot roast into careful squares and not looking up. Oliver was not an angry man. He had built his life on steadiness and practicality, on showing up and following through and solving what was solvable. Anger had always seemed to him like a resource he spent too quickly on things that required a different tool. But lying in the dark of his own bedroom, next to his wife, he felt something colder and more focused than anger. He felt the specific clarity that comes when a long, confusing situation suddenly arranges itself into a shape you can see all at once. Amelia had not been manipulated into drifting away from him. She had chosen. She had chosen while their daughter was being dismantled, while 8-year-old Mary was losing her art program and her friendships and her sense of herself as a person who had done nothing wrong. Amelia had stood in the kitchen and searched that child's backpack and stood there with her arms crossed and said she needs to be honest. She had done that while simultaneously making plans with someone else and letting her mother construct a lie that was destroying their daughter's social world. He thought about the father he had tried to be, the Saturday lunches and the Sunday library trips and the art program enrollment, the colored pencils in the tin case, the hours sitting on the edge of a bed in the dark, staying until she fell back asleep. He thought about what it meant that he had been doing all of that alone, that the house he believed they were both trying to hold together had only been held by one set of hands, and the other set had been reaching somewhere else entirely. He didn't confront her that night, not the next day either. He needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly required him to know what he was building toward before he started building. So he lay there in the dark and made plans. And in the morning he got up at 5 and went to work and was steady and present the way he was always steady and present, because Mary needed that from him more than ever. The divorce papers arrived in January, delivered in a sealed envelope that Amelia left on the kitchen table with a sticky note that said only, "Oliver, from my attorney." He stood in his jacket and read them. Then he folded them and put them in his back pocket and went to find Mary. She was in her room, drawing. She looked up when he came in, open-faced, expectant, the way she always looked when he appeared in her doorway. "Hi, Dad." "Hey, Bug. What are you working on?" She held up the green notebook. She'd drawn their backyard in detail. The old birch tree with the bark she described once as looking like a map, the fence with the loose board third from the gate, the lawn chair they'd painted green together last spring. She got in the afternoon light somehow, the slant of it across the grass, accurate in the way things are accurate when someone has looked at them over and over because they love them. "That's really good," Oliver said. She lowered the notebook. She didn't respond to compliments easily. She'd been learning not to receive them. Lately, in the same way she'd been learning not to cry in the kitchen, by watching the people around her discount them. He sat in the desk chair and stayed with her for a while. He didn't tell her about the papers that night. She was 8. There would be a time and a way for that conversation, and it wasn't tonight, in her room, while she was drawing the backyard they both still needed to believe in. He called a lawyer the following morning before his shift. The referral had come from a man at the plant who'd been through the same thing 3 years ago and spoke about it with the practical, unsentimental clarity of someone who had survived it. Oliver explained the situation in brief, factual terms. The lawyer listened. Oliver made notes. A meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. He was methodical about it. He listed his assets, his income, his documentation. He thought about what primary custody would require him to demonstrate and began demonstrating it in advance. He requested Mary's school attendance records. Perfect. He kept her medical appointments. He had a stable address, a stable job, a stable life. He was going to present those facts to whoever needed to hear them. Meanwhile, the story about Mary kept circulating. It had moved over the months of autumn from the school and the immediate neighborhood into the broader social landscape of the area. The parents at the weekend recreational complex, the women Amelia knew from her previous job, the people who crossed paths at the grocery store and the elementary school gate. The lie had become established in the way rumors become established when they go long enough without challenge. It was simply known. You didn't need a source anymore. It was the kind of thing people referenced as background, as context, as the sort of thing you just knew. Oliver went to Mary's 2 classroom teachers and asked, directly and on record, whether any item had ever been documented as taken by Mary, whether anything had ever been found on her person or in her bag. Both teachers said no. He noted the dates and their names in a file he kept on his phone. He was building a record. He wasn't sure yet exactly how he was going to use it, but he knew he would, because he'd been paying attention to something. He'd been paying attention for months, logging it, going back over it. And he was certain now, every single accusation, from the very first one at the fundraiser table, had Delia in the chain. Not always visibly, not always directly, but she was always upstream. She was always the first to hear, the first to tell Amelia, the first to name it at dinner with that particular, slow, deliberate weight. She was always nearby when something happened. She was always present just before Oliver came home, just before the conversation shifted, just before another small piece of Mary's world went quiet. He thought about that pattern for a long time, and then he thought about what it would take to break it open. The trap was simple. He chose simple deliberately. Simple closed the gaps. Simple left nothing to interpret. He bought a small camera, the kind that looked like a phone charger, and mounted it near the upper cabinet in the kitchen, pointing toward the counter. He tested it for a week, checking the feed from his phone in the break room at work, making sure the angle was right, making sure the footage was clear. It was. On a Saturday afternoon, when Delia arrived for her regular visit and settled in the living room with Amelia, Oliver slipped a small white envelope from his jacket pocket and set it on the kitchen counter. Inside was $40 in cash. He placed it casually near the fruit bowl, the way someone might leave a bill they meant to deal with later. He said nothing to anyone. He went to the backyard with Mary and pushed her on the old tire swing while the sky went iron gray above the bare winter trees. He stayed out there for nearly an hour. When they came back in, the envelope was gone. Oliver cooked dinner. He helped Mary with her spelling homework at the kitchen table. He was calm and present and did not look at the spot on the counter where the envelope had been. He kept his phone face down in his jacket pocket and his face entirely ordinary. After Mary was in bed, he sat in the living room with a book he wasn't reading. Amelia was in the kitchen. He could hear her cleaning up. Her phone rang at 8:40. She answered in the kitchen, and Oliver heard her move to the other room with it, which told him she didn't want him to hear. He moved quietly to a position near the hallway. The door was not fully closed. Delia's voice was audible even at a distance. "I found something tonight," she said, "in Mary's bag, when I was getting my coat from the hallway. I think you should look." Amelia's voice. What was it? Money. A white envelope. It was on the counter, and then it was gone. I put two and two together, and I checked her bag. A pause. I didn't want to say anything while Oliver was around. Oliver stood in the hallway. He had known this was coming. He'd set it up for this exactly, but hearing it still produced a feeling he hadn't quite anticipated. Not anger. Something sharper. A deep, confirming clarity. This was who Delia was. This was the machine, running the same program it had been running for months, producing the same output. He had just turned a light on inside it. He went back to the living room before Amelia came out. She appeared in the doorway a minute later, phone in hand, her face carrying the particular assembled certainty of someone who has already decided what they believe and is now moving toward the confrontation. "I need to look through Mary's bag." "Why?" Oliver said. He said it as if he didn't know. "Delia found cash in there. A white envelope." How did Delia find it? She was getting her coat from the Amelia stopped. Something shifted slightly in her expression, a flicker of something, but it passed. She noticed it. "I see," Oliver said. He stood. "Call her back. Tell her to come over right now." Amelia looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want to show both of you something." Delia arrived 20 minutes later. She came in without knocking, coat still buttoned, moving through the front door with her usual ease of ownership. Oliver was in the kitchen. He heard her come in, heard the small sounds were settling, heard Amelia's low voice, and then Delia's response. He stood at the counter and waited. They both came into the kitchen. Amelia first, then Delia behind her. Amelia's arms were folded. Delia looked satisfied. Not obviously, not in a way you could have pointed to and named without knowing her. But Oliver had studied Delia Crane for years, and he knew the difference between her neutral expression and her satisfied one. This was the satisfied one. She thought this was another episode in a continuing series. She thought this was the story, arriving at another predictable chapter. "You found the envelope," Oliver said to Delia. "I did." She set her purse on the chair. "It was on the counter when I came through for my coat. Then it was gone. I checked her bag." "You checked her bag," Oliver said. He let the words sit for a moment. Without being asked, somebody had to. There was an edge of impatience in her voice now. Her bag was right there. The money was missing. "I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't noticed." Oliver nodded slowly. He took his phone from his jacket and opened the camera footage. He'd already cued it. He held the screen toward them. "I'd like you both to watch this," he said. The footage was quiet. The kitchen counter, the fruit bowl, the white envelope in clear view. The timestamp in the corner, the clock marking the afternoon at just past 2. And then Delia entered the frame from the left. She moved purposefully, directly to the counter. She picked up the envelope. She opened the flap and looked inside. She held it for a moment, then folded it once. She walked out of frame. 17 seconds passed. Then she came back in a frame from the left, moved to the hallway, reached up to the peg where Mary's backpack hung, unzipped the front pocket, and tucked the envelope inside with smooth, practiced efficiency. 28 seconds from the time she first touched the envelope to the time she zipped the bag. Oliver lowered the phone. The kitchen was completely silent. Amelia's hands were gripping the edge of the table. Her knuckles were white. Her face had gone the color of something that has had the blood drained out of it, and she was staring at the phone in Oliver's hand with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not anger, not grief, but something deeper and more structural, the expression of someone watching the load-bearing wall of everything they believe collapse in 28 seconds of footage. Delia was very still. She was also looking at the phone, but her expression was different. She was calculating, you could see it, the rapid, internal reassembly of a position under threat. She was deciding what to say next. "You set me up," Delia said finally. "I left an envelope on a counter," Oliver said. "You made every choice after that." Delia turned to Amelia. Something in her shifted, pivoting. She was abandoning the footage and trying a different angle. Amelia, this is exactly the kind of thing I've been telling you about. He sets traps. Why? Amelia's voice came out in a single syllable, barely above a whisper. She wasn't asking for a full explanation. She was asking the essential question, the one underneath all the others. Delia was quiet for a moment. Then, because she needed to learn, the words landed like something that had been dropped from a height. Learn what? Amelia said. Her voice had more substance now, thicker with something building. Discipline. Delia's chin went up a fraction. Consequences. You were never going to give them to her. You let him give her everything she wanted and call it love. She was going to grow up thinking the world worked that way. I was trying to teach her that it doesn't, by making everyone think she was a thief. Amelia said it slowly, like she was hearing the sentence for the first time as she spoke it, by giving her something real to deal with, something that would require her till she's 8 years old. Amelia's voice broke on the last word. She's 8. She lost her art program. She lost her friends. She spent months, thinking people hated her, and she didn't know why. She's 8 years old and you're too soft, Delia said. She said it with conviction, with the righteous certainty of a woman who has held a position too long to question it. You've both been too soft, and I was trying to get out, Oliver said. He said it without raising his voice. He said it the way you say something that is simply true, plainly, directly, without decoration. Delia looked at Amelia, waiting for the support she had always been able to find there, waiting for the orbital pull to reassert itself, for Amelia to drift back toward her gravity the way she always had. Amelia was looking at the table. Amelia. Delia's voice had an edge now, a command in it that had always worked before. Get out, Amelia said. It was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet from all the other quiet evenings in this kitchen. This was a door closing. Delia gathered her purse. She adjusted the strap. She walked to the front door with her back straight and her coat still fully buttoned, as if the posture could substitute for dignity. She pulled the door shut behind her. The sound it made was barely anything, just a soft click in the silence. After she left, Amelia stood at the kitchen table without moving for a long time. Oliver went to the counter and stood there, watching her process what she had just seen. He could read the stages of it the way you read weather, disbelief first, and then the rapid, devastating reassessment, going back through every moment she had accepted as true because Delia had handed it to her. The missing items, the bag checks, the school letter. The afternoon she had stood in this kitchen with her arms folded while her daughter quietly gathered her belongings and tried not to cry. I didn't know she was doing it, Amelia said. I didn't know she was physically. I know you didn't, Oliver said. But Amelia, you didn't look. She looked at him. She brought you a story about your daughter, and you accepted it. Every time. Not once did you ask for something concrete. A date, a witness, a teacher's statement. You took your mother's word, and you applied it directly to Mary. He kept his voice even. Not hard, not cruel. Just accounting for what had happened. You checked her backpack for months. You stood in this kitchen and told her she needed to be honest. You pulled away from her at exactly the moment she needed you the most. Amelia pressed her fingers against her mouth. Her eyes were bright. I'm not saying this to make you feel worse than you already do, Oliver said. I'm saying it because you should understand it clearly, so you know what actually happened and what needs to be different going forward. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice. Oliver left her there and went upstairs. He checked on Mary, who was asleep on her back with one arm stretched above her head, the green notebook on a nightstand. Her face was completely still in sleep, the way children's faces go still. No guarding, no control, just rest. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment. Then he went to the other room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. He thought about everything that came next. The divorce moving fast now. The custody arrangement. The house. The logistics. The calendar of a separated life. He thought about it in the practical, forward-moving way that was the only way he knew how to think in a crisis. Not dwelling on what had been damaged, but working out what could be built. He had the video. He had his documentation. He had his lawyer and a meeting scheduled for Tuesday. He had everything he needed. And more than any of that, he had Mary, asleep across the hallway, notebook on a nightstand, going back to the art program on Monday. That was the only thing that had ever actually been at stake here. Everything else was logistics. Logistics he could handle. The truth moved the same routes the lie had traveled, and it moved just as fast. Oliver's lawyer sent a formal letter to the principal's office the following week. Documented accusations. A timeline. The impact on a minor student. A request for an immediate review of the decision to remove Mary from the art program. The letter was 3 pages and precise, and the school board responded within days. Mary was reinstated. A letter went home to every family in her grade. The assistant principal called Oliver and apologized in a way that was clearly scripted but genuinely uncomfortable to deliver. Oliver listened to the entire thing without interrupting. He said, "My daughter will be in the program on Monday." He said, "I expect this will not happen again." He said nothing else, because nothing else was required. The school had made itself accountable. That was what mattered. The parents were harder. Not harder to reach. The information got to them through the same informal channels everything traveled on Fair Street, but harder to face, because most of them had to reckon with the fact that they had used their discomfort to exclude a child. Some of them came to Oliver at pickup or in the parking lot at the grocery store to say something between an apology and an explanation. He listened to all of them without making it easy. He didn't rage, didn't shame them, didn't give them the absolution they were quietly seeking. He listened and nodded and let them carry the discomfort without taking it from them. That was consequence enough. What he focused on was Mary. He told her the truth in pieces at the pace she could handle. He told her that Grandma Delia had done something wrong, that Delia had been the one putting things in her bag and making people think she was responsible. He told her that the truth had come out. He told her the art program was giving her back her spot. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug of hot chocolate and thought about all of it in her careful, methodical way. "So she put the money in my bag on purpose?" Mary said, "Yes. To make people think I stole it. Yes." She was quiet for a while. Why would a person do that? It was the question Oliver had been sitting with for months. He thought about how to answer it without giving his daughter a more complicated weight to carry than necessary. Some people, he said, decide they know what's right and they stop thinking about how much damage they cause getting there. She thought she was teaching you something. She wasn't. She was just hurting you, and that was wrong. Mary considered this. She turned the mug slowly in her hands. "She's Mom's mom," she said after a moment. Not an argument, just a statement of fact, something she was placing in the landscape of her understanding. "She is," Oliver said. "Is Mom okay?" Oliver paused. He looked at his daughter across the table. This child who had spent months being treated as the source of a problem she had nothing to do with, and whose first response on learning the truth was to ask whether someone else was okay. He felt something tight in his chest. "Mom is going to be okay," he said. "She made some mistakes. She's working through them." Mary nodded slowly. She seemed to accept that. She lowered her chin toward the mug and breathed in the steam. Mary thought about this for a long time, holding her mug. Then she nodded in that slow, considered way she had when she'd arrived at a conclusion she could live with. That evening she asked whether she could go back to art on Monday. He said yes. She smiled. It was careful still, like a window opened just a little to test the temperature. But it was real, and it was there, and he held on to it. The divorce moved through winter and into spring with the bureaucratic patience these things required. Lawyers, meetings, paperwork that multiplied and required signatures, and then produced more paperwork. Amelia was cooperative. Oliver had prepared himself for resistance on custody and didn't encounter it. He thought she was cooperating partly from guilt and partly from an exhaustion that had settled into her after the evening in the kitchen, a deep tiredness that came from watching something you trusted completely reveal itself as something else. Primary custody went to Oliver. Amelia would have structured, scheduled time with Mary. The arrangement was clear and documented. Oliver had what he needed. Derek lasted about as long as Oliver had expected. The man Amelia had been seeing disappeared from her life within weeks of the divorce being filed. This information came to Oliver secondhand. He neither sought it nor avoided it. And on a street like Ferris Street, it arrived whether you wanted it or not. Derek, it emerged, had been interested in Amelia in the context of a manageable situation. Once the situation became a public, messy, legally involved divorce, the context changed. He was gone before the paperwork was complete. Oliver thought about that sometimes, the specific cruelty of it. Not to himself, but to Amelia. She had risked her marriage and her family and her daughter's stability for someone who vanished the moment real difficulty appeared. He didn't feel sorry for her in any deep sense. She had made those choices. But he recognized the particular loneliness of that kind of abandonment, and he filed it away without comment. Amelia's standing in the neighborhood shifted. Not because Oliver said anything about it. He said nothing to anyone beyond what was necessary, but because the story had enough force of its own. The parents who had treated Mary as a problem, who had signed their children away from her at birthday parties and in the art program, now had to account for having been instruments of a sustained lie told to them by a woman they trusted. Some of them redirected that discomfort toward Amelia, because Amelia had let her mother operate from inside her house for years. The goodwill she'd built over a decade on Ferris Street didn't vanish overnight, but it eroded quietly and steadily, the way things erode when the foundation beneath them has been found to be less solid than everyone assumed. Oliver watched none of this with pleasure. He watched it because it was happening adjacent to his life, and understanding it was part of planning what came after. Delia's collapse was the most thorough. What she had done was not a single bad decision or a moment of poor judgment. It was a sustained, deliberate campaign against an 8-year-old child. Months of careful effort to isolate that child from her community, to give her neighbors and classmates and teachers a reason to turn away from her, to cause her to ask her father, "Why does everyone think I'm bad?" That wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a miscalculation. It was something chosen repeatedly over many months, with full awareness of what it was doing to a girl who had done nothing to deserve it except exist in a space Delia wanted to control. Once the video became known, and it did, because Amelia told people, needing to explain her own failures and perhaps believing that confession was its own form of repair, Delia's social world contracted with a completeness that required no assistance from Oliver. The church circle she'd attended for 30 years. The Thursday card games. The neighbors who had been in and out of her kitchen for decades. They fell away, one by one. The way people fall away from someone once they've seen something about them they genuinely cannot reconcile with who they thought that person was. Because the people who had known Delia longest also had grandchildren and nieces and children of their own. And when you understand that someone systematically destroyed a little girl's reputation for the purpose of controlling a marriage that wasn't theirs, when you understand that clearly, with evidence, the relationship becomes something different. Delia called Amelia several times in the weeks after. Amelia mentioned this to Oliver in passing, during one of the logistical conversations they still needed to have about Mary's schedule. The calls were full of justification and explanation, apparently. Full of being misunderstood, of good intentions gone wrong, of the world being unfair. Amelia stopped answering them after a while. Oliver did not feel satisfaction about this. What he felt was acknowledgement, the clean, settling feeling of a situation having arrived at its accurate conclusion. Delia had made choices. The choices had consequences. That was the entire story. Amelia came to the house one evening in April. It was a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Oliver answered the door. Mary was at the kitchen table with her spelling words. He left the door open and went back to the kitchen to be close to her, and Amelia came in and stopped in the front hallway, not quite entering. She looked different from the woman who had stood in the kitchen in January watching Delia leave. There was something that had been stripped away from her in the months between. Not a bad thing, exactly, but something she'd been wearing for a long time that had finally come off. She looked tired and also somehow more herself than she had in a while. "I want to talk," she said. "Mary's doing her words," Oliver said. He kept his voice neutral. "I know. I just wanted to," she stopped. She was choosing carefully. "I wanted to say I was wrong. About all of it. About believing my mother instead of looking at my own daughter. About the bag checks and not defending her at school and all of it. I know that, doesn't Amelia?" He said her name with nothing in it but acknowledgement. "The apology you owe isn't to me." She looked at him. What happened to Mary, the months of it, everything she went through, the questions she was asking herself. That's what needs addressing. And you can address it. She still loves you. That's not in question. But she needs you to be honest with her, not just sorry in a general way. She's 9. She's old enough to understand what happened if you explain it clearly. He paused. "Give her that. The rest will follow." Amelia nodded. She held herself together with a visible effort. "Can I see her?" she said. "Yeah." He stepped aside. He went to the far end of the kitchen and found something to do at the counter while Amelia sat down beside Mary at the table. He heard Amelia say, quietly, "Hey, can I see what you're working on?" And after a short pause, a pause that was Mary deciding, he heard the sound of the green notebook being turned across the table. He didn't listen to the rest. He stayed at the counter and let them have it. They moved in June, not far, across Akron to a quieter part of the city, a street with larger lots and fewer houses pressed together. A 2-bedroom house with a garage and a patch of yard in the back where the afternoon light came through well. Mary had mentioned, once in passing, that she thought she might want to grow tomatoes someday. There was room here for that. On the morning they packed the last boxes, Oliver walked through the Ferris Street house one final time. He went room by room without hurrying. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the upper cabinet where the camera had sat, and then at the counter where he'd placed the envelope. He stood in the hallway where he'd heard Delia's voice through the wall. He stood in Mary's old room, which was empty now except for the square of lighter paint on the wall where her small bookshelf had stood. The house had been the scene of something that had tried to break them. It hadn't broken them. He pulled the door closed behind him and left it. On moving day, Oliver drove the last load over in the afternoon, Mary in the passenger seat with a green notebook in her lap. He watched Ferris Street get smaller in the rearview mirror and then disappear behind a turn. He felt nothing complicated about it. He felt the clean, ordinary feeling of finished chapter, the rubber smell of the plant, Delia's voice through the wall, the weight of those months in that house, all of it receding. He didn't need to carry it forward. Mary was looking out the side window at the neighborhood sliding past. After a while, she said, without turning from the window, "Will I keep going to the same school? For the rest of the year, yes. After that, we'll figure out what makes sense." She nodded. She drew something small in the notebook without looking down, just making a mark. "Dad, yeah. People don't think that about me anymore, right?" He drove for a moment before answering. He wanted to get the answer exactly right. "No," he said. "They don't." She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "Okay," in a small, settling way, like she was putting something down that she'd been carrying for a long time and was finally sure she didn't need it anymore. Oliver kept his eyes on the road and his hands steady on the wheel. He thought about the months behind them, the envelope on the counter, the camera in the kitchen, the 28 seconds of footage, the lawyer's letters, the school board meeting, the Tuesday evenings doing paperwork while Mary slept upstairs. He thought about the night he'd stood in the hallway of his own house and listened to Delia's voice through the wall and understood, clearly and completely, what was happening to his family. He thought about the long patience of it, the months of watching and logging and holding his strategy close while continuing to show up every morning and every evening like the steady, reliable, unremarkable man that Delia had counted on him remaining. She had looked at his steadiness and seen passivity. She had mistaken consistency for compliance. That had been her most consequential error. He had set a simple trap. He had gathered simple evidence. He had done it without drama, without confrontation, without giving away the strategy until the strategy was complete. He had walked through everything that followed, the divorce, the custody arrangement, the lawyers, the meetings, with the same steadiness he applied to everything, because Mary was watching and Mary needed him steady. He didn't forgive Amelia. He had thought about it, not with sentimentality, but as a practical matter, as a question of what forgiveness required and whether the requirements were met. Forgiveness was something you offered when a person had made a mistake, had been overwhelmed or confused or caught in circumstances they didn't understand. What Amelia had done was different. She had been a mother with a child in front of her, a child who was asking for her protection with every empty backpack on the kitchen table, and she had looked at Delia instead. That wasn't a mistake. That was a sustained failure of the most basic instinct a parent was supposed to have. He could make his peace with it. He had made his peace with it, because the alternative was to spend the rest of his life carrying weight that didn't belong to him. But making peace with something wasn't the same as forgiving it. He didn't forgive Delia at all. He didn't construct a philosophical position about it. He simply knew what Delia had done and what it had cost and what kind of person would choose to do it. Some things were not the right size for forgiveness. They were the right size for acknowledgement and for making sure they couldn't happen again. He had made sure. The custody arrangement was clear. The documentation was in place. If anything like this was ever attempted again, he had a lawyer, a file, and a video on his phone that had already proven what he was capable of doing with evidence. Nothing about his situation was fragile anymore. What he had instead of forgiveness was something he found to be worth considerably more: clarity and his daughter in the seat beside him and the rest of the year in front of them. 6 months after they moved, Mary's drawing was hung in the hallway outside the main office at her school. She had made it for the end-of-year art show, large, detailed, layered in colored pencil with a patience that her teacher described to Oliver as remarkable for her age. She'd spent 4 weeks on it, working after school and on weekend mornings, coming to him sometimes with questions about how the light fell in their old backyard at a certain hour. He'd answered what he could remember. The drawing was their old house on Ferris Street. The birch tree with the bark that looked like a map, the fence with the loose board third from the gate, the green lawn chair, the patch of yard where the afternoon light came down in that particular slanted way in late summer. She had rendered it with an accuracy and care that made it look less like a drawing and more like memory. Not the memory of a child who had escaped something, but the memory of a child who had looked at a place clearly, including everything that happened there, and had decided that it was still worth recording. Oliver stood in front of it for longer than he intended on the Thursday evening the school opened to show. Parents moved through the hallway around him. He stood there and looked at his daughter's work and felt something settle deep in his chest, something that had been working towards settling for a long time. Mary found him there. She came and stood beside him and looked at her own drawing, tilting her head slightly the way she did when she was evaluating something. "Do you like it?" she said. "Yeah," Oliver said. "I really do." She studied the drawing for another moment. "I wanted to remember it right," she said, "before I started to remember it wrong." Oliver looked at his daughter. She was 9 now, still the same quiet, observant, thoughtful person she had always been, still carrying the green notebook everywhere, still drawing the world with more attention and care than most adults gave it. But there was something back in her face that had been absent for most of the past year. A settled quality, a sense of being safe inside her own life, of trusting the ground beneath her feet. It had come back in small degrees over the months since the move, the way light changes before sunrise. Gradual, then suddenly complete. "You remembered it right," he said. She smiled. The full, open, unhesitating smile he hadn't seen clearly in too long. No caution in it, no checking first to see whether it was safe. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, the way she always had. They stood in front of her drawing while the other families moved through the warm, ordinary light of the hallway around them. It was enough. It was exactly enough.